Hi folks, Puffin here with Antifa News Briefa for August 26, 2021. It's based on news stories from August 25th, 2021 that really upset me from the radio, public radio. And what really upset me was these white supremacist racist ideas. I know what you're thinking, isn't public radio supposed to be liberal? Well, the problem is we have such a bad problem of white supremacy racism in America that it's an insidious problem that's pervasive and influences all these different aspects of society to the extent that even people who are, probably good people with good intentions end up promoting these white supremacist ideas without even really realizing it. And I feel like this is a good example of showing how sometimes these ideas aren't applied directly to a race situation or something like that, but they are the ideas that are part of white supremacy and need to be rooted out. This is why when Lady Gaga was talking to Dr. King about ending white supremacy, she was focused a lot on unlearning. So unlearning some ideas that are components, and there's all sorts of ideas that are components of white supremacy, even if they don't necessarily trigger race things, although they're often, you can root them in racism as well. So in this case, the idea that is being promoted, that's really clear to see in these stories about the pandemic, about responses to the pandemic, is this notion that some people's comfort or preferences are more important than other people's lives. Now, when you think about it, that's really foundational to the whole mask debate. That's what the first story was. It was a story on, well, it wasn't even a story, it was an ad for an upcoming story on Colorado Public Radio about the mask debate. Now, in Colorado, we have a Democratic governor, but we have, kind of independent Republican and Democratic electorate. So they call it a purple state, although it's becoming more Democratic. And he's the first gay governor, I think, in the country, but of Colorado for sure. And what shocks me and upsets me about that situation of having a Democratic governor who hasn't made a statewide mask mandate, and I'm sure some Democratic governors have, but there's Republican governors who are fighting against masks. So they only have the interest, supposedly, the shouting of one section of the population in mind. They're only catering to their interest at the risk of everyone else. And putting everyone else at risk and putting them at risk too. It's really just, genocide. It's really terrible terrorism. And then on the other side, yes, there are some Democratic governors who are not concerned with those people's concerns and are just ready to make mask mandates. And I think that's the smart and appropriate thing to do. Is it just because we have a, more mixed electorate that Governor Polis has to, leave it up to the counties? That's just a recipe for inviting protesters in, harassment of your school and local officials, just putting it on them to enforce their mask mandates if they want to have them against people who can, respond and harass them locally in person. Like Governor Polis, I really encourage you to go ahead and make a mask mandate. And this maybe isn't a good analogy, but I feel like it's something you can relate to as our first gay governor. The same people who you're trying to appease by saying, oh, you can not have masks if you want in your counties or whatever, some of them don't think you should be able to be married. Some of them don't think you should be able to be gay. Some of them think that you'll go to hell for being gay. Do you want to compromise with those people? Would you compromise with them and say, well, one of us will go to hell? Don't compromise with terrorists who've been misled and brainwashed by KGB, KKK, anti-human terrorists and traitors. Don't compromise with them. Just, you've got the power to lay down the law, lay it down, say mask mandates, keep us safe. So, and you keep us safe from both the threats of patchworks of response and the threats of people getting all emboldened to go protest and harass people. You can shut all that down, or maybe they'll come harass you or something, but then you'll know who they are and they'll all be in one place. So, we've got to stop this genocide. And to me, it was a terrible example in this ad from Colorado Public Radio where they're talking about the mask mandate debate. It's just, saying we're going to talk about this in an upcoming show. And they played one clip from, a person who had something to say about it. And what he had to say was, kids need to see each other's facial expressions and stuff, which is true. It's important that kids do need to see each other's facial expressions, that's an important part of communication. But it's not to be at the risk of people's lives. And just trying to put any other concern at the risk of people's lives ultimately relies on this idea our comfort or our preference or our privilege is more important than certain people's lives, other people's lives. And that's just not true. But that is a foundation of white supremacy. So when you notice it, you need to root it out. Now, the other example was NPR, because that was Colorado Public Radio. It's not. But the NPR story that I heard the whole full story on China's response to the virus. And they painted it all like it's China being too harsh. And they mentioned, just kind of in passing, China has some weeks gotten their death counts from the Trump virus down to single digits, meaning only a handful of people died in China, or at least in provinces. I don't know exactly, because they just kind of passed over the information. But got it down to single digits in places with this technique of basic lockdown. Anytime there's a Delta variant test positive, they just lock it down. And then the whole story for like 15 minutes or so was about, 5 minutes at least, was about, this businessman who had been separated from his family by being in China and his family having to be in America or whatever. Or this student who couldn't finish his research project. I'm sorry for anybody whose life's been disrupted by COVID, but how are those things more important than other people's lives? And if they have gotten it down to single digits, and they have severe lockdown things, and whatever the other consequences of the severe lockdowns are, they're keeping people alive. And how can we in America present that just because there's so much anti-Chinese bias, and that gets back to racism and white supremacy directly, but how can we be so used to that concept that some people's preference is more important than other people's lives, or that some people's lives don't matter or whatever? How can we be so used to that we criticize China for having such an effective strategy at stopping Trump virus genocide or Trump virus spreading there? I wish we had such a strong strategy. I wish we'd started with such a if we'd had a real president, not a Putin puppet, we could have started with who was trying to spread the genocide. Because started with the strategy strong a year and a half ago, and locked it down and shut it down, and not been one of the main factories in the world for promoting and putting out Trump virus, because America was one of the worst ones. And maybe still is. So it's very upsetting to me to hear these things and then to realize 2 times in one day, once in the local public radio, there's this presumption that we need to, because we're a liberal radio station, we need to put let everybody know that we want your attention. We want to know we're sharing your perspective too, to the conservatives. And it's just disgusting to me, because we don't really need to say, does anybody want to yell fire in this theater? We don't need to invite that type of talk and criticism that puts people's lives in danger. And we don't need to think that, hey, some people's privilege or some people's lives. Let's debate. Go with lives. And when China's done that, we don't need to criticize them just because we're so incredibly racist and trying to come up with some reason to put down China. And that was NPR. That was National Public Radio. So it's just it's very upsetting to me that these people act like, they think it's so important that people can see their face. Newsflash, people that don't want to wear masks aren't pretty. Nobody's trying to look at you. It would probably be a good, customary, polite thing to do for a lot of people just to wear masks anyway. But especially now when it can save people's lives. And whining about it is the worst look ever. And whining about countries that whatever you're trying to come up with is the problem they have for saving the most lives by lockdown measures. They didn't mention anything about being abusive to people or locking down people in some type of dangerous way. All they could try to say is this is cutting China off from the world in different ways, and these are different detrimental effects. How are they acting like any business associations are more important than people's lives? Because it's this American perspective that's based on that and always trying to reinforce it. Sexism, racism, homophobia, all those types of ideas that when they're always pushed out, and no matter how mildly they're pushed out, they're all part of that same program. So we have to resist it. And I appreciate you listening to me rant about it here. But Thanks, and stay tuned for the next Antifa News Briefa.